Hi dear friends, today's topic of discussion is going to be on complications of pediatrical mechanical ventilation in brief. I will be touching upon the different complications that we encounter in our daily practice. Please note that I will not be discussing about ventilator associated pneumonia because that is a separate topic in itself. I have divided it into complications that you encounter when you are intubating a patient, when you are ventilating a patient and when you are extubating a child. So what are the considerations you have to give when you are intubating? You will have to decide the type of tube, whether it's a cuffed tube or an uncuffed tube. Earlier there was the misconception that the cuffed tube should not be used in children below 8 years because it causes more injury because of the increased pressure inside the cuff. But right now you have better cuffed tubes, micro cuffs, which do not cause as much injury, and it is in fact preferred even in younger kids as young as less than 3 kilos. So yes, cuffed tubes can be used. The only thing you have to note is make sure the cuff pressure is always below 20 centimeter of water, and if it is an uncuffed tube, allow for air leak around the tube above or 20 centimeter of water inspiratory pressure. As to the entry, either it is going to be a nasotracheal or a orotracheal, depends on the intensivist or the pediatrician at the bedside. You do have certain indications and contraindications for a nasotracheal versus orotracheal intubation. For example, nasotracheal intubation is contraindicated in a base of skull fracture, and nasotracheal intubation has the advantage of having lesser extubations compared to that of your orotracheal intubation, but it's more difficult to perform unless you are experienced in it. Size of the tubing, we use this formula on a day-to-day basis, Cole's formula, which is age in years by 4 plus 4, and it is for uncuffed transtracheal tube or endotracheal tube. If you want to use a cuffed tube, size it down by 0.5 mm from the value that you have derived from this formula. And what about the depth of insertion? By a thumb rule, the internal diameter of the endotracheal tube into 3 is the depth to which you will secure the endotracheal tube. It's important for us to know what size you are using so that you can choose your appropriate pressure support when you are doing your ventilator settings. Intubation in pediatrics is comparatively more difficult compared to that of adults. What am I saying? Comparatively compared. Yeah, it is difficult compared to adults. The reason being there are unique differences in the airway anatomy. Like the tongue is larger in children compared to that of adults, and especially when the child is sedated, it can fall back on and obstruct the airway, and the epiglottis is more floppy and relatively larger. Subglottic region is the functionally narrowest portion of the pediatric airway versus vocal cords as that of in adults, and cricothyroid membrane position and size is different. So if you have to do a cricothyrotomy, you will have to remember this. And it goes on and on. I will link another video where we have discussed about the differences in pediatric airway compared to that of adult airway. But yes, so that is why you need to know the differences in order to position the child appropriately. If you extend too much, you will not be able to see. If you flex the head too much, again you are going to obstruct the airway. So a sniffing dog position will be the perfect position for you to intubate the child. What are the complications that you can expect while you are intubating or immediately post extubation? The child can go in for hypoxia, especially if you have not pre-oxygenated in a child who is already hypoxemic. The child can have a cardiac arrest or a severe cardiovascular collapse. This we discussed in our previous class, right, where we talked about your drop in preload, especially when you are positively ventilating the patient. So immediately post ventilation, you have a severe drop in preload which can result in shock and cardiovascular collapse and arrest. You can put the tube in the wrong hole. You can put it in esophagus. So you will have to watch out for that. The patient can have dangerous agitation, or if the patient is agitating too much, or if you have not sedated the patient well, or it's a difficult airway per se, there can be oral trauma, there can be teeth avulsion, or there can be injury to lips, tongue and gums. This I think all of us must have seen. And if the patient has not been nilperoral, then there is a risk of aspiration of gastric content. So how do you avoid these complications? To avoid hypoxia, you pre-oxygenate the child with 100% FiO2 for 3 minutes to 5 minutes before you are trying to intubate, depending upon your sequence of intubation, that is. To avoid the cardiovascular collapse or arrest in a patient who is already in shock or who is already in hypovolemia, do a volume loading prior to ventilation. You want to avoid esophageal intubation. One, gain experience by intubating more and more patients. You can confirm the positioning of the tube with an end-tidal carbon dioxide monitor. So if you are in the trachea, you will have a nice waveform of EtCO2. If you are in the esophagus, you will have a almost flat line, suggesting that there is no carbon dioxide to come out of the esophagus. Make sure you use a capnography rather than just a capnometry, especially a color changing one. Another thing that I want to discuss before we go into this slide is intubation in a patient with DKA. Okay, so DKA, I know I am slightly digressing, but imagine this patient who is having severe acidosis, okay, 6.9, 6.8, and to compensate for this acidosis, this patient is hyperventilating. This patient is pushing out carbon dioxide to compensate. Again, we discussed this in ABG discussion. So in this patient who is having such a low carbon dioxide, imagine that you are intubating the patient. If you are not swift, if you delay by even a little bit of time, imagine what's going to happen to the carbon dioxide of this patient. It's going to shoot up. Even if it shoots up a little bit, the amount of compensation that the patient has worked for so much has gone for a toss. This patient is going to go for a mixed acidosis, further worsening the pH, further worsening the overall status of the patient. So that is why in a patient with DKA, try to avoid intubation as much as possible, and only if required you will do an intubation, and that too under carefully controlled settings, keeping this particular caveat in mind. Alright, so this slide talks about our standard DOPE technique. DOPE is nothing but D for displacement, O for obstruction, P for pneumothorax, E for equipment failure. You have intubated the child or the patient is on ventilator already. The patient was doing well, but suddenly seems to be deteriorating due to some XYZ reason, and that XYZ is by DOPE. First, check for displacement of the tube. See if the endotracheal tube has dislodged into esophagus or it has gone inside a bronchus. Okay, so 2 into a right bronchus will cause what? Only it will look like a single lung ventilation, right? Your left lung is not going to get ventilated at all, so that will collapse. O is for obstruction. Secretions can obstruct the tube, resulting in increased resistance and difficult ventilation. P is for pneumothorax. Again, so one lung is not going to ventilate at all because the pneumothorax is going to compress that lung. E is equipment failure. So the patient side everything is okay. From tube to the alveolar end to the pleural end everything is okay, but the equipment, the ventilator is not providing the adequate breath. Okay, so this is how you rule out causes one by one in a patient who has a sudden deterioration on a ventilator. Next, coming to complications on mechanical ventilation. So the patient is being ventilated right now. So the different complications are usually called as a VILI, ventilation induced lung injury. Earlier this was called ventilator induced lung injury, but then they thought that okay, ventilator is just a machine. You are the one who is going to set the machine, right? You are the one who is going to adjust the settings and all that. So it should be ventilation induced lung injury rather than ventilator induced lung injury. So there are different sorts of trauma that can happen. Atelectotrauma, volutrauma, barotrauma, biotrauma, mechanical trauma, and self-induced lung injury. So let's see about them one by one, little bit, okay, not in depth, just little bit. So what is atelectotrauma and why does it happen? See, a patient whom you are ventilating for a pneumonia or a ARDS has surfactant dysfunction, has pulmonary edema, and this weight of the edematous lung is going to cause atelectasis of the surrounding alveoli. and on top of that you are causing continuous opening and closing of these atelectatic alveoli. If you are providing adequate pressures, these are potentially recruitable. Okay, so these are potentially recruitable alveoli, but since you are continuously opening and closing on top of the surfactant dysfunction, you are causing atelectotrauma. How are you going to prevent this? You can prevent this by doing a low tidal volume ventilation. This is what ARDS is all about, right? So earlier it was high tidal volume ventilation, and now we are shifting over to low tidal volume ventilation. So low tidal volume ventilation means low airway driving pressures. This low airway driving pressure is not going to exceed the critical opening pressure of collapsed alveoli or collapsed lung unit. Next, your PWP, which is set above the critical closing pressure, will cause sustained recruitment of this atelectatic alveoli and prevents it from recollapsing again, so that there is sustained opening of these alveolar units. So this is how you prevent your atelectotrauma: low tidal volume and adequate PWP or optimal PWP. What about barotrauma and your volutrauma? Let us talk about an interesting experiment, which is the Dreyfus experiment. Okay, so the Dreyfus experiment was conducted in animals, and they conducted in 3 different settings. Okay, so one was high pressure and high volume, and for another animal, rat, what they did was they gave high pressures but low volume. They achieved that by giving a negative pressure ventilation, iron lung type of ventilation. Then another animal had low pressure ventilation and high volume ventilation. Forgive my handwriting, I am trying to do this on my laptop. So how did they do this? They actually banded the chest of the animal so that the compliance is reduced. It will not be able to expand too much. Okay. So they did all this to see which is going to cause more injury. Okay. Wait a second. I think I have confused these two. The increased pressure one, your pressure will increase only if your chest is not going to expand too much, right? Right. I am sorry for this. So there was a band around the animal, and in low pressure and high volume, this was like a negative pressure ventilation, iron lung ventilation. So what they concluded was volutrauma was bad compared to that of your barotrauma, and the animals who had ventilation with high volumes had more injury compared to that of animals with ventilation with higher pressures. But the problem in this study was they did not account for the fact that they both go hand in hand. And by pressures, you do not just mean the airway pressure. It's actually the transpulmonary difference that matters at the end of the day. It's not just volume or airway pressure. So barotrauma, I mean, in the barest sense, barotrauma is injury due to high transpulmonary pressures. Volume injury, volutrauma is due to alveolar overdistension, which is due to increased volume, right? So if you see in this, increased pressure, increased volume caused injury. Alright, that's a straightforward thing. Here, if you put a band in the chest, it does not mean you are just giving lesser volume. Okay, you are also reducing the transpulmonary pressure between your pleural and your inside pressure, alveolar pressures. This we discussed in one of the basics of mechanical ventilation. Okay, so it's not the airway pressure that matters, it's the transpulmonary pressure. Okay, so the strapping group, it actually impeded the chest wall excursion. So this resulted in both decreased lung volumes and decreased transpulmonary pressure, not the pressure that they have set. The transpulmonary pressure was less. And conversely, in the group who had this so-called low pressure high volume ventilation, okay, so this negative pressure that they set, you know, what happened if you are going to increase your pleural negativity, it means your transpulmonary pressure is going to increase. Am I right? I hope you are getting my point across. Alright, so if this transpulmonary pressure is going to increase, so this becomes a state with high pressure and high volume, right? And that is the reason the middle group did not have much injury, whereas the first and the third groups had higher injuries, because both had higher transpulmonary pressures and higher volumes. So what I am trying to say is both are related to each other, and what determines the injury is your transpulmonary pressure and your volume at the end of the day. So cyclical versus tonically held pressure and volume. Okay, it's not just enough you say I have given 20 PIP or 25 PIP or 30 PIP, or it's not enough for you to say I have given 10 ml per kilos of tidal volume or 8 ml per kilos of tidal volume. How you gave, that's what matters. A cyclical deformation, meaning recruitment and de-recruitment, recruitment and de-recruitment, like you are blowing in and out a balloon, that is more injurious compared to that of sustained deformation or sustained opening of the alveoli. So if you see for the same inspiratory pressure and tidal volume, relative contributions of PWP will hold more importance than you adjusting your tidal volume to improve the status of the patient. Or in other words, increasing your PWP will be less injurious than increasing your tidal volume. Okay. So suppose you are ventilating a patient, and if you find that your inspiratory pressures have already exceeded, but you are not achieving your targets of oxygenation or ventilation. Okay. So in that case, you can decrease your tidal volume rather than your PWP. Okay, you know that you cannot exceed your inspiratory pressures anymore. You cannot touch your pressures, in fact. So in that case, you can decrease the tidal volume rather than reducing your PWP. Reducing your PWP is going to collapse the recruited alveoli, and that is not good for the diseased lungs. Next, coming to biotrauma. So what we saw earlier, atelectotrauma. Atelectotrauma is avoided by low volume and high PWP. Then how do you avoid barotrauma and volutrauma? Again, optimal pressures and optimal volumes. Try to do a tonical or tonic distension rather than a cyclical deformation of the alveolar units, and adjusting your tidal volume to a lower one might be more beneficial than decreasing your PWP, because you are going to de-recruit your lungs. Biotrauma is like a cytokine cascade. Okay. So if you are going to ventilate a patient, that actually releases injurious inflammatory cytokine cascade. But so what if it releases? What's going to happen? See, all of your blood volume is going to go through the lungs into the heart, right? And this blood is going to carry all the inflammatory cytokines that are released in the injured lung, and that is going to go into heart, and that's going to directly go into circulation all over the body, and this causes an increased risk of multi-organ dysfunction and death. So in order to prevent this, do a lung protective ventilation with low volume ventilation. What about mechanical trauma? Okay, so mechanical trauma is, as the name suggests, it's mechanical. The pure act of distension and collapsing is mechanical trauma. So what is shear strain? Shear strain is the angular deformation of an object related to its resting conformation. Strain is the same thing expressed as a ratio. Okay, so change in the size or shape of an object relative to its resting shape expressed as a ratio of displacement, okay, divided by the reference size. Stress is force per unit area that balances the external load. Like we discussed ventricular stress in our cardiopulmonary interaction, here you are talking about lung stress, which is otherwise labeled as your transpulmonary pressures. So in mechanical trauma, what happens? There is lung inhomogeneity in a diseased lung, isn't it so? A is your normal lung units where you have nice beautiful alveoli which are interdependent on each other, but they are doing well. Imagine the B state, second one. What happens here? you have the central alveoli which is atelectatic. Okay. So this is causing inward collapse of the walls, and what this causes is actually shear strain, right? The adjacent alveoli, since they are mechanically dependent or interdependent on each other, it causes shear strain on the adjacent alveoli, and this shear strain causes inhomogeneity. Inhomogeneity, I am sorry. Okay. So additional shear strain will happen because not all alveoli are going to look alike. Imagine this C condition, it's the opposite of B, right? So in C, what is happening? There is asymmetric inflation of the center alveolus. Okay. So there is fluid accumulation, let's assume. Okay. So because of this, there is again shear strain on the adjacent alveoli, isn't it so? Rest of the adjacent alveoli are getting collapsed with each other, and this is going to collapse the adjacent alveoli to it, and it goes so on and so forth. It depends on the amount of injury that is happening. This is a CT chest that is showing basically the regional stress that is happening. So the light blue ones means low stress, orange regions are moderate stress, and these dark orange or dark red ones are high stress areas. Again, they talk about lung inhomogeneity. Our aim is to improve the homogeneity. See, whenever the lungs or the alveolar units are similar to each other, it causes the least strain, and that is what we are going to strive towards. Okay. So a homogeneous alveolar inflation will always minimize strain. So how do you ensure homogeneity? By better recruitment of alveoli, so that none of them are collapsed, and better drainage of the fluid, so that none of them are too over distended either. So you can do that by increasing your PWP and your prone positioning. What is this concept of patient self-induced lung injury? This is an interesting concept that is gaining more and more importance nowadays. It's due to three basic things. One is over distension, okay, or increased lung stress or increased transpulmonary pressures. The second one is increased lung perfusion, and the third one is patient ventilator asynchrony. Here it is exactly like the name suggests. The injury is due to patient spontaneous ventilation. Okay, so this is not something that is ventilation induced or a ventilator induced, you can say. This is more of patient spontaneous breathing actually affecting the patient's lungs. So the three things: over distension or increased transpulmonary pressure or increased lung stress, can we say, right? And increased lung perfusion and increased patient ventilator asynchrony. So how are these related to a self-induced lung injury? Imagine you are ventilating a patient in a pressure controlled mode. Okay. So if you are ventilating a patient in pressure control mode, that means you are putting a cap on the pressure, but there is no cap on the volume, right? Because volume is a dependent variable, and if there is too much stress for the patient's effort may end up being injurious to the patient. Okay. Because if there is a superimposed patient effort on top of what you have set, this superimposed patient effort can cause decreased pleural pressure or a more negative pleural pressure. Then the lung stress and strain will become too much, and too much volume gets in, resulting in again injury. All of this is why? Because patient try to take an extra deep breath. In a volume control mode, then what happens? You must say, then if pressure control mode is going to cause this sort of injury, volume control mode should be safe, no? But again, volume control mode is it's not as simple as it sounds. Volume control mode also ends up in the same patient self-induced lung injury category. Patient effort can still augment both stress and strain. So let's see how it is. So normally the lung is like in a fluid, okay. So any pressure is equally transmitted or distributed across the lung surface, because this is like a homogeneous unit, okay. But in a diseased lung, the solid consolidations that you have are going to work like a solid rather than a fluid, and these solid consolidations will amplify the pleural pressure, especially in the dependent area of the lungs. Okay, so there is actually unequal. My English is poor today, I am sorry. So whatever it is, there is a unequal pressure distribution between the non-dependent and the dependent lungs. Okay, and when the diaphragm contracts, the pleural pressure falls more around these solid areas compared to the non-dependent areas or the liquid sort of areas. This is just an approximation, this is not actually what happens inside. Okay, but you get the idea, right? So a dependent lung which is going to be more solid is going to have a more increase in the fall of the pleural pressure. Okay. Consequently, the stress is increased near the diaphragm, and this pulls air away from the non-dependent regions. These are the normal regions where you want air circulation, not the areas in which there is consolidation, alveoli are collapsed and atelectatic. Am I right? But what happens because of the increased drop in pressure in the area surrounding the consolidation or the solid like area, the air gets pulled into these not so good zone from the good zone, which is not what we want. Okay. So this is what happens in a self-induced lung injury if the patient is allowed to breathe spontaneously. So now that we have talked about how the transpulmonary pressure is going to change the ventilation, there is one other concept in the same self-induced lung injury, which is the conjoint triangle of distress. We talked about the stress racers. Let us talk about the other two parameters. This is what happens typically in a patient with ARDS. They already have increased stress, isn't it so? And on top of that, if you are not going to give adequate PWP to recruit the dependent area which is collapsed, and the patient is as a result going to have an increased respiratory effort, and that is going to end up with the patient having a self-induced lung injury. So what is the answer for this? So should we completely paralyze the patient? Is that the answer? Again, it's not as simple as that. I think we should discuss about this more in your ARDS discussions. Okay. So, I'm sorry. So this is a conflicting area. Okay. So the studies which have been done earlier showed, better results in patients with milder disease if the patient was having a spontaneous ventilation. Okay. So milder disease, spontaneous ventilation with higher PWP seem to be beneficial, and severe disease, try not to allow the patient to spontaneously breathe and all that, so much were there. But PWP, know that it homogenizes the lung. If it's going to homogenize the lung, it means it's going to reduce the stress racers. So PWP is going to protect against your self-induced lung injury, and this decreases the solid state of lung, and that is what is causing all this inhomogeneity, diaphragm not acting properly and pulling in more pressure and all that, isn't it so? And recent studies have shown that even milder ARDS can result in a spontaneous induced lung injury, especially if the patient is going to be ventilated with low PWP. So what is the answer at the end of the day? I am sorry, I went to the next slide, no? Unfortunately, I am unable to go back to the previous slide. So the answer to avoid self-induced lung injury is PWP and prone positioning, because both of them reduce stress racers. Reduction of stress racers is going to reduce the self-induced lung injury. What are the complications expected at extubation? Complications expected at extubation are mainly your post-extubation stridor and distress and need for re-intubation. Self-extubation, yes, and worsening of hemodynamic status, yes. So self-extubation, you need to adequately sedate the patient, make sure there is no asynchrony between the patient and the ventilator, right, and properly secure the tubings. That's also important. And how do you avoid worsening of the hemodynamic status? Make sure the cause for which you ventilated is not there when you are planning for extubation. Alright. So suppose you have intubated a patient for left ventricular failure, your positive pressure ventilation is going to work like a left ventricular assist device. This is what we discussed in previous session on cardiopulmonary interactions. So if you are going to prematurely extubate a patient, you are going to devoid that patient of your extra support from your positive pressure ventilation, resulting in rapid worsening of the left ventricular status. So make sure the patient is extubation ready before actually extubating. What about post-extubation stridor and need for reintubation? So this is an infant's airway and this is an adult's airway. So the diameters are 4 mm and 8 mm. Imagine a situation where there is a edema. This is not seen. There is an edema. Suppose there is a 2 mm reduction in the total diameter. Okay. What happens? The intraluminal diameter which is working is only 2 against that of 6 in an adult. What happens to the resistance then? The resistance increases too much, 16 times, because the cross-sectional area has reduced by more than 75%. Whereas compared to an adult, the cross-sectional area has reduced only by 44%. So resistance increase is not that high. And hence the importance of avoiding your laryngeal edema and your airway edema in a patient who is intubated and ventilated. So post-extubation stridor has an incidence of anywhere between 1.6 to 6%, and the main risk factor is duration of ventilation. Cuffed versus uncuffed, there is no difference. You can use either of them. Okay. So earlier there was this low volume high pressure cuff which led to the complications that were part of your cuffed endotracheal tubes. But right now you are having high volume low pressure cuffed ET tubes and micro cuffed tubes which are definitely safe. And the main risk factor is duration of ventilation. I am stressing this again. The more duration, the higher risk of the patient having a post-extubation stridor. So let's talk about the risk factors. So before you ventilate itself, if the patient is having some sort of a tracheal problem or your upper airway problem, it can be an infection, narrowing, inflammation secondary to a reflux, or the patient is having a neurological impairment, or during intubation you are doing these 3 T's. Too big a tube, too tight cuff, or a traumatic intubation and multiple intubations. Or during ventilation, you have to multiple times intubate the patient due to some reason. Maybe the patient is extubating multiple times, or the patient is aggressive because you are not sedating the patient adequately, or you are doing a vigorous suctioning of the patient with high pressures. All of these can result in injury and laryngeal edema. And post-extubation, when the patient is having a stridor, it is important for you as a clinician to differentiate it between or differentiate it from a laryngeal paralysis. How do you prevent this stridor? You can use small doses of dexamethasone. Okay. When do you use? You use in a situation where you expect the patient to go on to have a post-extubation stridor, like a patient who has had multiple airway instrumentations or traumatic intubations or prolonged intubation of more than 2 weeks, or previously failed extubation this patient has had. Then consider doing a dexamethasone 0.2 mg per kg given 6 hours before extubation and every 6 hours for up to 24 hours after extubation. How do you manage a stridor? You can reassure, sit the child up, give humidified oxygen, give an adrenaline nebulizer of 0.4 ml per kilos, a maximum of 5 ml undiluted adrenaline diluted with a normal saline of 2 to 4 ml, and you can give the nebulizer via a face mask. This is effective only if laryngeal edema is present, okay, not for post-extubation failure. Can be repeated up to 3 times every 15 to 20 minutes. You can also use budesonide. What are the things that will determine the patient's need for reintubation? Again, it is almost similar to that of your post-extubation stridor, I can say. If the patient has had a prolonged ventilation or the patient is having too much laryngeal edema after extubation, too much stridor, respiratory distress, then again you will need to ventilate the patient. Or if the underlying condition has not yet resolved, the patient is worsening hemodynamically, you will have to intubate again. Or too much intubation can cause deconditioning of respiratory muscles and depressed ventilatory drive. So if these are there, then you need the patient to be more conditioned or more interested in ventilating themselves, I can say, because the ventilator is doing the job for them. Their muscles go for a toss, their ventilatory drive is depressed, so you can't extubate a patient successfully like that. Depressed respiratory drive can also happen because of underlying neurological condition that has happened during ventilation, maybe a stroke, or it can be because the patient is not yet completely out of sedation. So these are some of the common causes that you should think of when you have a patient whom you are re-intubating. Only if you know the cause, you will be able to rectify it the next time you are planning for extubation. Always remember, when you are intubating a patient, you should plan at that time itself as to how long the patient will be on a ventilator and when you are planning to extubate. Okay, it should be a daily exercise when you are doing your daily rounds. Stand beside the patient and think if the patient is going to be ready for extubation. If not, why? If yes, why? I think that's it. We have discussed the complications during, before, after your intubation and ventilation. I know I have not gone in depth about each and every topic, but this itself is coming to nearly half an hour. So thank you for listening to me. I will link up the articles which will be good for you as references. You can go through them to have a better understanding. Thank you all.